Welcome everybody. Welcome everyone to the Big Book Compendium, um, Fourth Dimension Big Book Study. As I was just saying, Kevin's away, so I'm Brad Silito. I'm a recovered alcoholic, and I'll be filling in for Kevin today. We like to start off with a few things. First off, I will read the set aside prayer, which to me is this prayer that I love for big book studies because it's a very good reminder that I need to remain open-minded to new ideas, or I will forever be stuck where I am. And so it starts with willingness to know that I'm wrong about things that I've always believed. So here it goes like this. God, today help me set aside everything I think I know about you, everything I think I know about myself, everything I think I know about others, and everything I think I know about my own recovery, so I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help me see the truth. And then, as this is the fourth dimension big book study, there's two places in our big book that mentions the fourth dimension. The first one is on page 8. Sorry, I'm not. I just have my little book today, so I'm reading like this a little bit. Uh, how dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. And on page 25, it says, here we are. When therefore we were approached by those with whom the problem had been solved, there was nothing left for us but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We have found much of heaven, and we have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. So that's the two places where it talks about that. Today we are starting on Roman numeral page XI, the forward to the second edition. That's correct. I wasn't here last week, but that's what Kevin's promised me. So that's the assumption I'm going with. Um, so I guess at this point, we've gone through the forward, or sorry, the preface, and then the forward to the first edition. The book has been in printing, if I remember correctly, for 16 years at this point. And they come out with the second edition, and there's going to be, so there's a much more lengthy forward to this edition, but it's going to give some of the earlier history of AA. So, forward to the second edition. Figures given in this forward describe the fellowship as it was in 1955, right? So the first edition, of the book was published in 1939. Now this is 1955. Remembering that we had a fellowship for 4 years before we had a big book, right? So this is 1955. Since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the early text, twos and threes and fives of us have sprung up in other communities, right? So AA is starting to grow, right? Remember in the early days, it started in Akron. Bill Wilson went home to New York City. A small group formed in New York City. A splinter group or a new group started in Cleveland. And then, we have all of these little ones and twos in places. And then the book gets published and AA starts to spread out, across North America in a much bigger way. So it says 16 years have elapsed between our first printing of this book and this presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics, right? So that number is important, that number of 150,000 alcoholics. Kevin would have talked about in the preface, on page VII, where in the first paragraph it said the first edition appeared in April 1939, and in the following 16 years, more than 300 copies went into circulation. And I imagine Kevin would have said, remember that number, 300,000, because we're going to come back to it. And this is where we come back to it. 16 years later, they have sold 300,000 versions of the book, and we have 150,000 recovered alcoholics, right? So that sounds like a success rate of 50%, right? We sell 1 million books a year, last I heard, and we don't get 500,000 new recovered alcoholics a year, right? We've been stagnated, for many, many years somewhere. I always hear 2 million people. My suspicion is it's higher than that now, but it's not, a new 500,000 sober people per year. Like we don't maintain that same 50% of sobriety, and that's what we're really here to talk about as we go through this book study, right? Is how do we improve? So groups are to be found in each of the United States and all the provinces of Canada. AA has flourishing communities in the British Isles, the Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia, and Hawaii. All told, promising beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and U.S. possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is but a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead. Right? So augury just means like an omen. It's like just an omen of what's to come, right? And we're going to see that as this book gets published, first in English, and this program of recovery gets out to the masses, we see AA really start to grow. And then we're going to see that it starts to get published in other languages. And then in countries where those languages are spoken, AA goes through the same growth that starts in North America or US and grows into North America. As the book is published and people can get their hands on this program of recovery, in other parts of the world, the growth will follow what's happened in North America. So the spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio in June 1935, right? That was June 10th, 1935, during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of the day, right? So they're talking about Bill Wilson, who had come into contact with Ebby Thatcher, right? And then he goes to Akron and he meets Dr. Bob. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From the doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Right? So, yeah, so Bill Wilson stays sober for 6 months, goes on this trip, right? And if we study the history of AA, we learn that he had this really big, well, his business deal didn't go well, and he had this really strong belief from some of his early experiences that he needed to work with others, and so he reaches out to Dr. Bob, and and start sharing what he had learned, right? And in those preceding 6 months in New York City, he was running around to finding drunks, finding alcoholics, and trying to save them. And he spent 6 months trying to, telling, because at this point, he had been attending the Oxford group, and he had got connected to a higher power. He'd had this bright white moment, and he's running around finding drunks and telling them, you've got to find God, you need God, and he's kind of preaching to them, and he's not really sharing with them the information that he has gotten so far. So I mean, maybe I'll just share this now, because I know whoops, can everybody see? Am I sharing the right thing? Everyone can see that? Okay, so we're kind of going to jump all over the place a little bit for where we're at, right? But what we're really talking about is these are the three things that I need to stay sober, right? I need to know what my problem is. I need to know what my solution is, and I need to know what the program of action is, right? And so as we're talking about Bill Wilson, and in his first 6 months, he had been admitted a number of times. And like I said, for where we are in the book, we're going to bounce around a little bit just to touch on this. But he had been into the Towns Hospital 4 times, Rob. Um, and from Dr. Silkworth, he learned what the grave nature of alcoholism was, right? This twofold disease where he had this obsession of the mind and this allergy or physical craving that happens when he introduced alcohol into his body. So he learned what this problem was from Dr. Silkworth. And then from Abby Thatcher, who had brought him this information, but he learned what the solution was, right? We just read it. Those what was then the Oxford Group 6 steps, right? But the solution, or sorry, that's the program of action. The solution being a vital spiritual experience, right? A connection to God, a connection to a higher power, and that actually originated and came through Dr. Carl Jung, right? And ends up with Abby Thatcher, and Abby Thatcher passes that on to Bill Wilson. And then the program of action comes from this Oxford group, and we just read that, right? Which was we need to clean house, make restitution, get connected to God, help others, all of those things, right? And that all came from the Oxford group. These two things, though, were brought to Bill Wilson by Abby Thatcher, right? So Bill Wilson becomes the first person who has all three pieces of the puzzle, right? So he then goes off. He's trying to keep people sober. He spent 6 months running around New York City, telling these alcoholics they've got to get religion and do this and that. Because at this point, he's got the Oxford Group was very much a Christian organization, and he had gotten connected to God by doing these, following some of the tenets of the Oxford Group, which was really designed to help people grow their connection to God. So he's running around trying to help all these people, and he's for however many. He's helped not one single person has gotten sober in his first 6 months. And he's very disheartened about this. And he thinks that, that he's not helping a single person. And he's about ready to give up. And his wife, Lois, points out to him that it has been working, right? And that he has managed to stay sober those 6 months. And so it's worked. His trying to help others has kept him sober. And that's, where this very strong belief comes from, that it started with Bill Wilson, where not a single new person stayed sober, but it kept him sober, trying to work with others, right? And at about the same time, Dr. Silkworth from the Towns Hospital suggested to him that rather than running around and trying to preach to people, for lack of a better word, and telling them what they have to do, is why doesn't he start sharing his life experiences with people and what his life was like and what things happened with him, and then share with him, what their problem was, and share the grave nature of alcoholism, and explain to them about this mental obsession and this physical craving, right? And this allergy, so Dr. Bob ends up being the first person that he shares that with. And that's and don't you know it works, right? And that lo and behold, it worked, and Dr. Bob got sober, right? So Kevin sent this to me, so I knew I better share it. He'll ask. So, and it might come up again as we read through here. I was just like, the first chance I get, we're getting it out of the way, because Kevin will ask us if we next week, he'd be like, I'm sure we talked about this, and he'll put it up here. So next week, remember, we talked about it at least once, maybe more. So so like I said, the program of the action was this moral inventory, confession of personal defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in a dependence upon God. So prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded only in keeping sober himself, right? That's part of what we were just talking about. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, right? And we won't go through all the details, but he's standing there in the Mayflower Hotel. He's making a bunch of phone calls, gets a hold of Reverend Tunks. He phones, phone call, comes back to him, and eventually he meets up with Dr. Bob, right? And meets the Akron physician. So the physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed, right? So interesting enough, Dr. Bob is already attending the Oxford group with his wife, right? And he's aware of this program of action that we're talking about, but he didn't know what his problem was and he didn't know what his solution was. I heard a really good analogy of this from a friend of mine from New York that I'm going to see in 2 weeks, actually. But he said, if I'm going to give you directions to my house, and I don't know where you are, I don't know where you're starting from, I can't give you directions very well, can I? To get to my house, right? So if I don't know what my problem is or my starting point is, how can I solve my problem? How can I get sober? I have to understand where I'm starting, right? He also then goes off to say, I start here every single morning. Um, I wake up as a selfish, self-centered alcoholic, and I need to understand that that's where I start each day, and that's why I have to do the things I have to do in the morning. So, anyways, if I don't know where I'm starting, I don't know where I'm going, right? I don't have the directions if I don't understand what the problem is. Sorry, am I still sharing my screen? I'm not, right? Yeah. So anyways, it's if I don't understand what the problem is, I don't have a starting point, right? So although he knew what the program of action was, he didn't understand what his problem was or that he needed this connection to God. And so Dr. Bob, was already trying spiritual means, but they had failed. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, right, he told him what the problem was, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster, right? So he now understood what his problem was. He starts doing, following this program of action in these steps and understands that he needs to attain this vital spiritual experience, right? Uh, oh, and when it says, malady is just a sickness, right? So he's pursuing this spiritual remedy for his sickness is really what he's doing. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery, right? And we're going to learn later on a little bit about the importance of step 9 because it was the one step that Dr. Bob balked at, and he drank and relapsed, um, only to go out and run around and make all of his amends one day, never to drink again. So later on we'll learn the importance of step 9, um, really through Dr. Bob's experience. So hence the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3, right? So his name was Bill Dodson. And in most AA rooms that you'll be in, you will see that poster or that picture of the two men sitting in chairs and the man sitting on the bed, and he's known as the man on the bed, or AA number 3. And, the very first, so Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson um, have, Dr. Bob gets sober. They immediately say, okay, we've got to work with more alcoholics. They go to AA number 3 and he gets sober, right? And so now I think, fortunately for us, I love that it happened with the very next guy because now they really believe they know what they're doing, right? I think it must have been a very significant point. It's actually on my arm right here. I think it's a really significant AA moment where that teaches us and tells us the importance of sponsorship, right? The chapter working with others in the first 2 paragraphs tells us, nothing will so much ensure my immunity to alcohol as working closely with others. It works when all else fails. Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's the picture. But I think that you're seeing in these early days, Bill Wilson changes tactics with Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob gets sober. Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob goes to meet Bill Dodson. Bill Dodson gets sober, right? So they really got to feel like they're onto something. Now things slow down after that. The things slow down considerably after that, and really take off when our book gets published, right? But I think it was very encouraging early successes, right? So So it says, their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. He never had another drink. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, so remember, he's been there since early June, right? He doesn't go home until the fall of 1935, right? 3 months. The first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time, right? Nobody realized it. A second small group promptly took shape in New York, to be followed in 1937 with the start of a third at Cleveland. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York, who were trying to form groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic, right? So by late 1935, so we're 2.5 years into it, right? And they start to realize that they're onto something, and that a number of people are really getting to have, substantial for the time sobriety, right? And that maybe there's a new dawn on the horizon, right? So it was now time, the struggling group thought, to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. Right, so they had a number of ideas. The only one of which came to fruition was publishing a book, right? This book called Alcoholics Anonymous. The other, another idea was they were going to have professional 12-steppers that traveled across America, doing 12-step work for a fee with people. Thankfully, that never came to fruition. And the other one was they were going to start building hospitals, and they'd have, run these hospitals for alcoholics. And that, of course, never came to fruition either. So the membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The flying blind period ended and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. Right? So up to this point, AA's, we've got this fellowship that's been around for 2.5 years, but it doesn't have a name, right? They were known for a while as the Drunk Squad of the Oxford Group. But, AA doesn't have a name. This book gets published. They go through a number of ideas and settle on the name Alcoholics Anonymous. And then our fellowship got the name from the book, right? Not the other way around, right? So Kevin always says, we are a book that has a fellowship, except we seem to think that we're a fellowship that occasionally has a book, right? That we don't study too much or enough, right? And it also says the flying blind period ended and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. So these are still the early pioneering days, that will, in the stories in the back of the book, you'll see, there's the first section's called the pioneers. We're still talking about the pioneering days, but they're saying the flying blind period ended. And to me, what that means is, did you ever play that game called Telephone, I think, when you were a kid, and all the kids get in a line and the kid at one end says something and they pass the message down, and then the kid at the other end says what the message was that he got, and then you compare how much it changed going through that line? Well, before we had a publication written by the first 100 alcoholics, AA and our program of action was by word of mouth. There was no written record of the exact steps that the first 100 people took. And so I could just imagine it was just like that telephone game, right? And in that the message might not be consistent, it might change, it might, and so if I don't get the 100% of the correct message, if I don't have access to it, and then, then I share it with somebody and the message just changes more over time, right? So we were really flying blind. Just, AA was a word of mouth thing, right? Our program of recovery, all of it was just by word of mouth. So once the publication was, once the book was published, and, I don't know if you know the history of how it was published, but it had, Bill Wilson was kind of the primary author, but he would write stuff and he'd send it out and other people would critique it, and, they'd argue about it and fight over it, and they'd finally settle on it, and, and then and they would make changes. So it was really, it was written by the first 100 people that were sober at the time. To get, because they really wanted to get the program right. They wanted agreement from everybody on what the program was. And so now that we get this publication, we're no longer flying blind. We don't have to worry about that telephone game anymore, right? We don't have to worry that the message is getting watered down. We don't have to worry that that a bunch of that some of the information that I have isn't correct, and then the information I pass on to you is changed again, and all of that stuff, right? We have a textbook that can guide us through this process now, right? So the flying blind period ended, and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. With the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Owsler, then editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics and God. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established, right? So remember, we're talking about there's 100 people sober, and all of a sudden we get 800 inquiries into this little office that exists, right? So all of a sudden, I mean, that would seem a little bit overwhelming, I think. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found, to the astonishment of everyone, that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery, right? So now that we have literature, we start to see that the number of people recovering is starting to mushroom, right? We're starting to see, instead of this really low, slow growth now, it's the mushrooming process has begun, as the book says. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, to which he invited AA members to tell their stories. News of this got on the world wires, inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstore to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. By March 1941, the membership had shot up to 2,000, right? Again, mushrooming, growing much more rapidly now, right? Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post and placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public that alcoholics in need of help really deluged us. By the close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. The mushrooming process was in full swing. AA had become a national institution, right? So the Saturday Evening Post article, written by Jack Alexander. Jack Alexander was this guy who, if there was something that seemed too good to be true, he went out to prove that it wasn't as good as it appeared to be. He wrote these hit pieces, and so he was sent out to write this article and shoot AA through full of holes, and figure out what the scam was, or what was up with it. And this article, there's a pamphlet. AA has a pamphlet that has the article, but you can Google it. It's easy to find. It's really easy to find. But anyways, he wrote this article, and I think, Rob, is that just the cover of the Evening Post? Okay, because I'll tell you a story about that. But he wrote this article. I think, and it's attached here now in the chat. But he went out to intending to shoot AA full of holes and do this hit piece on it, and then end up writing a very, very flattering article on it. And it was, and so that led to a whole lot more inquiries. I was in an antique store in Seattle, Washington 2 years ago, and they had a big stack of Saturday Evening Posts, old ones, new ones, and I went through the whole thing looking for this one. I didn't know what the cover looked like, but I did know the date. So I went through the whole stack thinking, of course it wouldn't be here, right? Like some alcoholic would have found it if it was, for sure. But anyways, it led to, it said AA numbered, by the close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. The mushrooming process was in full swing, right? So our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period, right? So up to this point, we've been talking about the pioneer days. They call it the pioneer stage, or the early days, the first 100, and then, on from there. But now we get into what we're calling the adolescent stage. Just like I'm a baby, then I'm an adolescent, and then I'm a grown up, right? And so the adolescent stage was hard for all of us, I'm imagining, not just me, right? So AA was no different, right? We entered this fearsome and exciting adolescent period. The test that it faced was this: could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be the schisms which would split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and in every group. But out of this frightening and first disruptive at first disrupting experience, the conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. Right? Have you ever heard anybody say the steps are so I don't kill myself and the traditions are so we don't kill each other? Or has anybody ever heard things like that? That's really what we're talking about, right? That's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. But what they're really saying is that if I'm going to survive, we've got to stick together, right? And it's out of this time where all of these different problems are cropping up in AA. There are fights over money. There's a big deal over somebody passed away and left a lot of money to AA, and it was, what do we do with the money? Do we accept it? Do we not accept it? What do we deal? How do we deal with money? How do we deal with property? All of those things that our traditions are all about now are starting to crop up in groups all over the place, right? And what about membership? That, has anybody ever heard that the rule? What is it? Rule 62, right? There was at one point they gathered up what everybody's rules were for membership, and they came up with a list of, not all from one group, but from all the different groups. They came up with, or maybe it was one group. I can't remember the story exactly, but there was a list of 61 rules to get into membership, and so somebody came up with Rule 62, which don't take ourselves so damn seriously, right? And but it's during this time that all of these problems start to crop up, and and our traditions are born largely out of what was happening in different groups at the time. So that's really where, all of these problems, the traditions are, how do we deal with those problems, right? How do we, the traditions weren't just made up out of nothing. They were tried and tested through problems that the different groups were experiencing at the time. So as we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, we had to evolve principles by which the AA group and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively, right? So then you're going to hear all of the traditions in here. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but never govern, that each group was to be autonomous and there was to be no professional class of therapy. There were to be no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own voluntary contributions. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relations were to be based upon attraction rather than promotion. It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films and internet. And in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversies. Right? Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like our traditions at all? They're all in there, right? This was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 564 of this book. Though none of these principles had the force of rules or laws, they had become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed by our first international conference held in Cleveland, right? So these, 12 traditions sort of come out. Everyone, they're sort of adopted. And then there's the very first conference held in Cleveland, Ohio, where they're officially adopted, right? But they have no force, right? You can't be kicked out of AA, right? You can't, none of that stuff can happen. No, you don't have to participate in seventh tradition. None of them have any force behind them, but the membership by and large understands their importance, I think, right? And it makes AA very unique. There's not another organization that doesn't have bylaws and ways to penalize you and fine you or kick you out or any of that stuff, right? It makes AA is very, very unique in that way. Also in the way that it's works from the bottom up rather, like it's an inverted triangle membership type thing. So anyways, it makes AA very unique. So today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets that our society has. While the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were two principal reasons: the large numbers of recoveries and reunited homes, right? These made their impression everywhere, right? So, families are reunited, back together, and just the sheer number of people that are recovering from alcoholism, right? Getting sober. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings and at first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. Right? So our recovery rates are nowhere near, like here they're saying of those who came and really tried, 50% got sober, right? Just like we sold, what was it, 300,000 books in the first printing and had 150,000 sober people, right? Over 50% got sober. Then it says 25% sobered up after some relapses, right? Sounds like we're up to 75%, right? And then it said of the remainder, those who stayed showed improvement, right? They were better, right? So I think the part that we miss when we read that is it says, for those that came and really tried, right? And really tried. So I think our job, this is now we're talking my opinion, but I think we need to make it easy for people to really try. When I first came to AA and I would hear people say things like, they have to ask for help. You got to ask someone for help. You got to get us, you have to, you have to pick up the phone and phone somebody, right? We gave you a list of numbers. You got to phone somebody. I'm going to tell you what, I've phoned 0 people on that list, right? But if we make it easy for someone to try, like I think somebody's asking for help when they walk through our door, right? Think about this time period when they're looking for people, they're out there making 12-step calls and hunting down alcoholics to make it easy for them to try. We have them handed to us in our meetings, right? They walk through our door almost every meeting, right? And so I think it's up to us to help them be able to really try. I can't do it for them, right? But I can, instead of making sure my number's on a piece of paper that goes around the room, I can go and exchange phone numbers with that guy, and I can say, hey, can you I'm old, put my number in your phone, send me a text. Then I'll get you in my phone, right? And then now I've got him texting me, right? I'll send him a message back. Great. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you today. The next day I'll send him a text. Hey, how are you today? Right? And then I might say something like, we're doing a book study. Kevin's book study's on Tuesday night. You should join us, right? And if the guy doesn't respond, I try twice and he doesn't respond over the next 2 or 3 days, then you have to move on, right? But I think we need to do, my home group before I came back to Calgary and Lethbridge, at our business meeting, we would talk about what is our plan for when a newcomer shows up, right? Like, let's have a plan in place so that we know that, if it's going to be this guy, those of us here, we've all agreed we're going to go talk to that guy. I want to hang out and talk to my friends after a meeting, right? But we're there to go talk to that newcomer. That's why we're there. The whole reason we ask, is there any newcomers in the room, is so that we know who we need to go talk to in the room after, right? So anyways, that's my soapbox. I believe the stats are the same as they were way back then for those who really try. I think that those of you that come to these book studies and understand the literature and then sponsor people and help them really try, I think that the success rates are probably similar, right? But we just have to make it easy for them to really try, right? We have to be willing to help. So anyways, that's my big soapbox thing for the day so far. Sorry, back where were we? Yeah, I also find it interesting that, there's other thousands came to a few AA members meetings and first decided they didn't want the program, right? Like, how many times do you see somebody once or twice and, and then they're like, nope, this isn't for me. And they have to go back and dip their toe in the water a little longer. and you know, kind of get a little bit more hurt before they come back again, and hopefully they come back, right? All right, another reason for the wide acceptance of AA was the ministrations of friends in medicine, religion, and the press, together with innumerable others who became our able and persistent advocates. Without such support, AA could have made only the slowest progress. Some of the recommendations of AA's early medical and religious friends will be found further on in this book. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as with the men of religion, right? And we're going to learn in Bill's story, you know, when, you know, what we consider to be the defining moment of when AA became a spiritual program, right? Alcohol being no respecter of persons who are we are alcohol being no respecter of persons, we are an accurate cross section of America, and in distant lands the same democratic evening up process is now going on. Religious affiliates, we include Catholic, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, and a sprinkling of Muslims and Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women, right? So what they're saying really is alcoholism doesn't care who we are, right? Man, woman, older, younger, what religion, what background, ethnicity, financial status, you know, any of that stuff. They call it the big evening up process, right? Where it affects everybody in society, the entire cross section, right? So it says, at present, our membership is pyramiding at a rate of about 20% a year, right? Again, back to what we were saying, they sold those first 300,000 copies, 50% got sober. We said that when the book got published, you know, AA really started to take off through this mushrooming process. And, you know, now, you know, 16 years into it, AA is still growing at 20% per year, right? Not that kind of rate anymore, nowhere near that, right? So far, upon the total problem of several million actual and potential alcoholics in the world, we have made only a scratch. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem in all its ramifications. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. Yet it is our great hope that all those who have as yet found no answer may begin to find one in the pages of this book, and will presently join us on the high road to a new freedom. The end. Any questions about that? Any comments anybody wants to make before we move on? We'll get through all the forwards today, but I always ask people if they have questions. So everyone always says no, but I wish people would talk. Does anybody have anything they want to add that I missed or that's interesting or anything? All right, let's carry on. Forward to the third edition. By March 1976, when this edition went to the printer, the total worldwide membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 1 million, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries, right? So, and then there's number one, right? If I go to the bottom, it says 2000, in 2009, over 116,000 groups with AA in more than 180 countries, right? Depending on the printing of your book, it might say something different there, I think. And then I have a number two. It says 2007, 1/3 are women, about 1/9 30 and under. Sorry, we're going to get to that one still, but yeah. So we're going to see that, you know, grown large, hugely, and really reaching out to other demographics, right? The first 100 were largely middle-aged white men, right? Just because that's how it started. But now we're going to see that it's really starting to mushroom out throughout society. So surveys of groups in the United States and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out not only to more and more people, but to a wider and wider range. Women now make up more than 1/4 of the membership, right? And down here it says in 2007 it was 1/3, right? So the number of women is catching up to the number of men. Among newer members, the proportions are nearly 1/3. 7% of the AAs surveyed are less than 30 years of age, among them many in their teens, right? The basic principles of the AA program, it appears, hold good for individuals with many different lifestyles, just as the program has brought recovery to those of many different nationalities. The 12 steps that summarize the program may be called Los Doce Pasos in one country, Les Doce Etapas in another, but they trace exactly the same path to recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So the book is starting to be translated into other languages now, right? And spreading throughout the world. I one time I knew somebody that had done a big book study somewhere, I think in Central America, and so their book was in a different language. And the funny part then was the pages didn't line up, right? The pages in English, and so we might say the ABCs are on page 60, but for them it might be page 61 or 62 or 59 or whatever it was. But so in the book study, it was a little bit. He said it was a little bit funny. In spite of the great increase in the size and the span of this fellowship, at its core it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope. Right? All right. Any questions about that one? No comments? No. Okay. Well, let's read the forward to the fourth edition then. So now if you have a new book, it'll be the fourth edition. Although a fifth edition is coming out soon, right, Rob? Soon? We keep saying it's coming out soon. Okay. This fourth edition of Alcoholics Anonymous came off the press in November 2001 at the start of the new millennium. Since the third edition was published in 1976, worldwide membership of AA has just about doubled to an estimated 2 million or more, with nearly 100,800 groups meeting in approximately 150,000 countries around the world. So now remember, from the third edition to the fourth edition, it's been 25 years. And we've gone from 1 million to at the start of the fourth edition, we now have 2 million people, right? 2 million, our membership's around 2 million. That's the number I still hear, but I'm interested to hear what the fifth edition says, like where it's at. I've heard people talk about it might be 3 million now. But again, the fourth edition came out in 2001. So it's now been another almost 25 years. I'm interested to see how much they say AA has grown. I don't expect it to be a huge growth, but I don't know. Literature has played a major role in AA's growth, right? Like I said, the book gets published in first in English. AA starts to take off in North America and other English parts of the world, and then it starts to be published in other languages. And now it says, it's been that literature has played a major role in AA's growth, right? Having the textbook is key. So literature has played a major role in AA's growth, and a striking phenomena of the past quarter century has been the explosion of translations of our basic literature into many languages and dialects. In country after country where the AA seed was planted, it has taken root slowly at first, just like here, then growing by leaps and bounds when literature has become available, right? So the literature is key. Currently, Alcoholics Anonymous has been translated into 43 languages. As the message of recovery has reached larger numbers of people, it has also touched the lives of a vastly greater variety of suffering alcoholics. When the phrase, "we are people who normally would not mix," page 17 of this book, was written in 1939, it referred to a fellowship composed largely of men and a few women with quite similar social, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. Like so much of AA's basic text, those words have proved to be far more visionary than the founding members could ever have imagined, right? So I used to go to a meeting in downtown Calgary, a noon meeting, and downtown Calgary is even as far as downtowns go, is pretty interesting to me because it has a lot of businesses like professionals, but it also has a lot of shopping. There's an outdoor skateboard park. It's not far from the drop-in center. A bunch of churches, all that stuff. So I'd go to this meeting. It's called the Knox Nooner meeting. And when it says people who would normally not mix, there would be lawyers there. There was, lawyers, executives from oil and gas companies, regular workers from oil and gas companies. There was, people that had been homeless. I was there one time, and there was a comedian that was performing at the Saddle Dome that night was there. Like the mix of people who it truly is biggest stirring pot of people I think I would ever see on a consistent weekly basis, right? It's just such a group of people that would not mix. I can't read that line without always flashing back to that meeting. I mean, it's amazing. Just the mixture of people there. Uh, the stories added to this edition represent a membership whose characteristics of age, gender, race, and culture have widened and have deepened in to encompass virtually everyone the first 100 members could have hoped to reach, right? So they're talking about the stories in the back of the book when they added and subtracted different stories from the back of the book. Those stories are meant, that people can read them and hopefully identify with some or more of them. And if to be honest, if I'm looking at how their alcoholism is and progressed, I identify with all of them. But to have a story in there that is maybe, that someone that I can relate to a little bit, is why they changed those stories in the back of the book and to try to represent, our current membership, right? So while our literature has preserved the integrity of the AA message, right? It's not that telephone game, right? It's preserved the integrity of the AA message. Sweeping changes in society as a whole are reflected in new customs and practices within the fellowship. Taking advantage of technological advances, for example, AA members with computers can participate in meetings online, sharing with fellow alcoholics across the country or around the world. In any meeting, anywhere, AA share experience, strength, and hope with each other in order to stay sober and help other alcoholics. Modem to modem or face to face, AA speak the language of the heart in all its power and simplicity, right? So, way back in 2001, they said members with computers can participate in meetings online, right? Talk about foresight, right? 2020 came along and all of us were on meetings online, right? And I used to hear, and I mean, you would hear old timers say, you can't, the Zoom thing is breaking anonymity and all that. And in 2001, they said that, meetings were happening on computers already back then, right? And so, anyways, I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to do these meetings on Zoom. And as we know, there's people here from all over the place. And I'm going to stop here, Rob. Um, and we'll pick up with the doctor's opinion next week.